Shalom, I'm Princess Erica Sapoy de la Cruz, your discussant at this moment. Allow me to discuss the continuation of the Anglo-Saxon model, the U.S. economy. In here, I will be discussing the corporate governance, the market for corporate control, corporate incentives, capital markets, venture capital and markets and dynamism, full disclosure, regulation, and deregulation. Corporate governance. Corporate governance decides in whose interest a corporation, in which owners are not managers, will be run. In theory, corporations can be run in the interest of their shareholders, their stakeholders, or the community. The aim of this study is to review the two main competing models of corporate governance, the stakeholders and shareholder value. Shareholder are those who participate in the operation of the corporation as managers, employees, workers, suppliers, or buyers, but not as owners. Shareholder value is the value of the corporation in a stock market as measured by its market capitalization. The market capitalization is the number of shares outstanding times the stock price in the stock market where it is listed, such as the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, or NASDAQ. Large corporations everywhere are characterized by a separation of ownership and management. The managers of large U.S. corporations own only a small fraction of outstanding shares. The bulk of shares are owned by individuals either directly or through private pension and retirement funds. Some 50% of Americans own stock, a figure that may be the highest in the world. Insofar as a stock price reflects the anticipated value of future profits, managers committed to maximizing shareholder value sacrifice stakeholder interest to improve the profit performance. If a manufacturing corporation whose goal is creating shareholder value is suffering a slump in profits, management would be expected to downsize the labor force, announce layoffs, or seek lower-cost suppliers. Similarly, an airline would be expected to cease service to a low-yielding community despite the harm to that community. After Burley and Means focused attention on the separation of ownership from management, economists began to consider principal-agent problems and their solution if managers are not owners. Will they not run the corporation in their own interests or pay too much attention to employees rather than making the hard decision required to maximize profits? Two typically U.S. approaches to aligning the interests of managers and shareholders were apparent by the 1980s. A market for corporate control and incentive system for managers that would cause them to maximize shareholder value. The market for corporate control. A market for corporate control forces management to focus on a long-run profits. A market for corporate control exists when a rival management team has the opportunity to buy control of the corporation from its share owners. Prior to the 1980s, there were relatively few changes of management in large corporations, even in cases where the management did not live up to the company profit potential. With a large number of shareholders, the largest owning only a small percentage, it was too difficult for shareholders to organize hostile takeovers. Two developments changed this situation. First, as ordinary citizens began investing in private pension funds and in mutual stock funds, these funds acquired significant shares of large corporations. Today, institutional investors own more than 50% of all listed corporation stock and more than 60% of the listed stock of the 1,000 largest corporations. 20 Fidelity, Vanguard, and Kraft Teachers Retirement Fund each have hundreds of billions of dollars invested in stocks. Second, a new breed of corporate traders, individuals such as Carl Icahn, Michael Milken, and Warren Buffett, or investment banks such as Goldman Sachs, mobilize substantial funds to mount hostile takeovers against underperforming corporations. Corporate traders develop business plans showing how the corporation could earn higher profits under a different management. The corporate trader would then offer a price high enough above the current stock price to shareholders to acquire enough shares to replace the current management with a better management team. The U.S. market for corporate control really began in the early 1980s. Figure 11.4 shows how it took off. It was less active during the two recessions of the period. The market for corporate control became quite complex and effective in the 1980s and 1990s, using exotic instruments such as purchase of one company with shares of another or issuing junk bonds to raise funds to buy the targeted company. As its peak level of the activity in 2005 to 6, the market for corporate control arranged the purchase of corporates worth $2.5 trillion. The market for corporate control has become institutionalized in the United States and has spread throughout the world. Industrial and financial corporations now routinely have mergers and acquisitions. M&A departments. Mergers and acquisitions refer to the buying, selling, and merger of one company with another. The merger or acquisition can be friendly or hostile. A hostile merger or acquisition is one in which the targeted company actively opposes the takeover. Table 11.2 shows the largest worldwide deals to date. Corporate incentives. Corporations use incentives to align the interests of management with those of owners. Traditionally, U.S. executives receive a fixed salary plus a bonus based on the performance of the corporation, such as profitability. In the 1980s and 1990s, corporations began introducing different incentives to ensure that corporate executives and even middle managers were motivated to maximize shareholder value. The most prominent such instruments was the stock option. A stock option grants executives the right to buy a designated number of shares of the company at a specified price, often the stock price, on the day the stock options were granted. Stock options therefore give executives the incentive to maximize the stock price so they can cash in their stock options at a profit. In theory, the stock price should reflect the long-term, not short-term, profitability of the company. Hence, stock options should direct executives to think about the company's long-term performance. Other incentive devices involve matching employee contribution to their 401k retirement accounts invested in the corporation's own stock. Although employees can acquire the stock of other corporations, the offer of one free share for every share purchase can be enticing. If both upper and middle level of management own shares of the company, they have a personal interest in the stock price. A golden parachute is a provision for a limited number of top executives to receive generous severance bonuses if their company is taken over. Its purpose is to preventing the existing management from resisting corporate takeovers that in theory will install a better management with a better business plan and in the process drive up the stock price for shareholders. Some fear that maximizing shareholder value distorts the flow of information. This criticism argues that top executives will be tempted, as in the 2001 to 2002 scandals involving Aaron, Arthur, Andersen, and WorldCom, to withhold negative information such as sinking profit or other bad news. When information is distorted, stock prices are not properly valued and provide provide misleading information. In the aftermath of the corporate scandals of 2001 and 2002, there was alarm that many companies were providing false information to raise the share price. Investigation revealed that such practices were rare. It made no real sense for management to lie because they understood that they would eventually find out gains from false information and would be transitory and the personal risk would be huge. Capital markets. The manner in which capital markets function varies with the type of capitalist economic system. The capital market is the market in which businesses raise investment finance through the issue of stock and bonds and bank borrowing. Capital market can be either a primary or secondary market. In the primary market, the corporation sells issues new shares of stocks or bonds to buyers, such as sale of new shares are called initial public offerings. The secondary market is a second-hand market in which shares of stock or bonds that have already been issued are traded by one owner to another. It is in the primary market that investment financing is created. The American Anglo-Saxon capital market is one in which new shares are sold to private investors by underwriters. Underwriters organize the initial sale of shares, sometimes buying stakes in the company themselves. It is a public offering in the sense that theoretically any buyer willing to buy at the offering price can be accommodated. In U.S. stock markets, shares are issued on the various organized stock exchanges such as the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, the NADAQ Exchange, or numerous smaller exchanges. The listing of shares of stock in the large exchanges must follow the rules of the Securities and Exchange Commission of the exchange itself. The stock exchanges are private organizations that have established operating rules and punish underwriters, brokers, or companies that violate their rules. Full disclosure. Full disclosure is the principle that the corporation listing stock must make available to potential buyers all relevant information, good and bad, about the company. Neither the exchange nor the Securities and Exchange Commission issues a ruling on the merit of the company. Rather, their task is to ensure that potential buyers have full information about the company, such as a list of its officers, the use to which the funds will be put, any outstanding lawsuits, and potential conflicts of interest. The offer to sell new shares will be contained in a prospectus, which contains obligatory accounting in form prepared by a recognized accounting firm according to standard accounting procedures, generally accepted accounting procedure. The accounting statement always includes a statement from the accounting firms as to whether the firm can continue to exist as a going concern. As long as all relevant information is disclosed and other requirements specific to the exchange are met, such as reaching a minimal capitalization, the underwriter is free to sell the new shares to buyers. Unlike Europe, as we shall see in the next chapter, more investment is financed by the issues of stocks and bonds than through back financing. The financing of investment through stock markets, which is a characterized feature of the Anglo-Saxon model, means a separation of those who finance corporations from those who manage corporations. In the European and Asian models, which rely heavily on bank financing, the bank can be associated with the corporation and would be reluctant to withhold financing from a closely related company. Opponents of the Anglo-Saxon model of investment finance argue that stock markets are too volatile and are dominated by emotion. They believe it is better to have knowledgeable bankers deciding who should get investment financing. A disadvantage of bank financing, as we have said, is that the bank tends to get too closely linked to the corporation to make impartial investment decisions. Venture capital markets and dynamism. In Chapter 3, we discuss Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction. The U.S. capital market promotes dynamic change by moving capital around quickly. If one sector develops a new technology and another sector's technology lags, the capital market will automatically direct capital to develop the new technology. If consumer tastes change, new capital will flow to the sector with rising consumer demand. New business cannot develop without financing. Entirely new business concepts tend to come from new business startups. Economies that can raise venture capital for risky business startups will therefore prove more dynamic. Venture capital is financing through purchases of shares or loans to start up businesses. The United States has the world's most sophisticated system of venture capital, the prime example of which is the high-tech companies of Silicon Valley, which received their initial capital from venture capital firms located in the area. A venture capital fund provides startup capital to new firms and takes a stake in them in return. It then shepherds the firm through various stages of financing and development until it is ready for an IPO. If the venture capital fund takes a 50% stake in a company that later goes public for $5 million, its share is worth $2.5 billion. Table 11.4 shows the size of the U.S. venture capital market from 1995 to 2010. Top venture capital firms such as Kleiner Perkins, Goldfide and Byers, New Enterprise Associates, First Round Capital, and Sokia Capitals are hardly household names. They provide by world standards huge amounts of venture capital. In 1995, venture capital firms invested some $7 million. In one of their peak years, 2000, they supplied $100 billion to young firms before settling back to annual investment in the low $20 billion. See the table 11.4 for the total amounts of venture capital. Critics of venture capital complain that they make investments that are too risky. They are accused of creating investment bubbles. Indeed, venture capitalists invested too much in high-tech in 2000 and the immediate years before, leading to the bubble that burst in 2001. Venture capitalists, however, perform a vital function. They provide capital to new firms that otherwise would not qualify for bank loans. They give high-risk entrepreneurs a chance. Many fail, few succeed, but venture capitalists provide a hothouse for innovation. Of course, one of the great stories of entrepreneurship is that of Apple Computer as shown in Exhibit 11.1. In other countries that rely on bank finance, entrepreneurs with a vision would be hard-pressed to convince a state banker to lend them money. Without venture capital, economies cannot experiment with doing new things, whether they are crazy or brilliant ideas. One way to gauge dynamism is to compare the rankings of the largest U.S. corporations over time. Table 11.5 shows the dramatic changes in ranking over a relatively short two-decade period. In each period, different companies occupied the top ranks. Dow Chemical disappeared from the top 15 after 1985, Enron and WorldCom, ranked 7 and 13 in 2000, no longer exist. IBM, once accused of monopolizing the computer market, fell from the top ranks after 2000. The U.S. capital market punishes with great decisiveness and speed corporations that fail in their business plans. It rewards those who succeed with new infusion of capital to allow them. Regulation. The Constitution's Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause states that the government cannot take private property without due process and just compensation. The actual taking of private property by the state is rare, but the state can restrict property right and make private property less valuable by regulating it. If you own property along a busy highway and the state declares that it cannot be used for commercial purposes, your property in effect has been taken. The due process clause creates a dilemma. What should the state to do protect general welfare from the misuse of property by private owners? The Constitution did not intend for government to refrain from all action affecting property rights. The state rights to tax owners of property is clear, and the Constitution allowed eminent domain. Eminent domain is the right of the state to take property under certain conditions in the public interest, such as buying land for the construction of railways or making way for an interstate highway. From the Constitution adoption to the 1930s, the right of the federal government to regulate private businesses was strictly limited under John Marshall, Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835. The U.S. Supreme Court consistently ruled that the Constitution contract clause protected the right of contracts from state laws. Constitutional protection of private property began to break down starting in 1877 when the courts ruled in Moon v. Illinois is that businesses affected with the public interest were subject to regulation and control by state of Illinois. Figure 11.5 shows the huge growth in federal regulations, starting in 1970s and peaking in 1980. After slight rollbacks in the 1980s, the number of pages remains in excess of 80,000 per year. According to the Office of Federal Register in 1998, the Code of Federal Regulations, the official listing of all regulations in effect, contained a total of 134,723 pages in 2001 volume that claimed 19 feet of shelf space. In 1970, the CFR totaled only 54,834 pages. The Government Accountability Office reported that in the 4 fiscal years from 1996 to 1999, a total of 15,286 new federal regulations went into effect. Of these, 222 were classified as major rules, each one having an annual effect on the economy of at least 100 million. Table 11.6 lists just some of the major regulatory acts passed during a period of rapid expansion of regulatory agencies and their functions. Government regulation is either social or economic. Social regulation is regulation of health, safety, and environment. Examples include consumer product safety rules, environmental protection, and automobile safety and gasoline mileage requirements. Economic regulation is government involvement in markets such as setting prices, restricting corporation decision-making, and controlling competition. Examples include regulation of utility rates and market structures and the setting of local tax rates. Much economic regulation is done at the state or local level. Supporters of regulation point to its significant benefits over the past 30 years. The United States has made substantial progress in cleaning up air, water, and land, reducing lead pollution, and improving safety and design in airbags and infant safety seats. Regulation, however, cannot be evaluated only in terms of its benefits. Economically rational regulation should yield benefits in excess of its cost. Counterfactual information indicates what would have happened in the absence of a particular event. Deregulation in the 1960s and 1970s. The high cost and inefficiencies of regulation prompted a movement toward deregulation. Deregulation is the reduction of government regulation and the return of decision-making back to private businesses. The regulation began in the late 1970s. The Airline Deregulation Act, signed in October 1978, allowed the airlines rather than the Civil Aeronautics Board, which remarkably went out of existence in 1984, to set fares and choose routes. The United States' 30-year experience has shown that regulation leads to lower prices for most but not all consumers. The regulation has increased the diversity of services and consumers have more freedom of choice. The pattern of finger-pointing is now well established. When things go wrong, it is the fault of the regulation even if they may not be the case. The most spectacular was the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, which originated in the collapse of the home mortgage market. The financial institutions experienced huge losses. Some failed, others were bailed out by the government. Was this a failure of the regulation, or was it a failure of policy? The regulation allowed large financial institutions to speculate with bundles of mortgages, which proved to be worth little, but government policy encouraged risky lending to unqualified to mortgage borrowers.